The big issue, Evan, is not whether politics is heritable or not, because it is. I mean, the evidence is just so overwhelming right now that anyone who disagrees with that proposition, the onus is on them to say why this mountain of evidence saying otherwise is somehow wrong. It was our lab that did the first comprehensive political survey of a twins registry. There's been a ton of those studies done by now, and they all sort of like triangulate on politics not only being, or ideological orientation, not only being heritable, but being highly, like more heritable than a propensity to alcoholism, more heritable than sexual orientation. You know, the sorts of traits that people readily accept are genetically influenced. Politics is way higher than that. Genes don't produce a conservative attitude or a liberal attitude directly. What genes uncontroversially do is they build your biological information processing system. They build your central nervous system, which includes your brain. And these are the systems by which we interact with the world and make sense of it. The two big differences that have been found neurologically between liberals and conservatives are that conservatives tend to have larger and perhaps more active amygdalas, and liberals tend to have larger and perhaps more active anterior cingulate cortexes. We've looked at what sort of stimuli tend to get the attention of liberals versus conservatives. Conservatives tend to go straight to those threatening images, and they just tend to spend more time compared to liberals looking at those. One potential explanation is what these amygdala differences do is they just make some people more sensitive to potential threats in their environment. You know, politics seems to be sort of like this chronic stressor for people. I mean, Consistently what we found across, 4 separate studies, 4 different samples, there's even 2 different polling companies that we've used. And consistently what we're finding is 1 in 20 adults has had suicidal thoughts because of politics.
Dr. Kevin Smith, it's such a pleasure. Welcome to the podcast. I'd love for you to start off with some of the work that you do in your lab. Let's start there.
So my lab is a psychophysiology lab. So mostly what I'm looking at is how people respond to various stimuli. And what I'm measuring when I say respond to various stimuli is basically their fight or flight system and their rest or digest system. Basically the systems that sort of like subconsciously keep us in homeostasis or balance that prepare us to take an action. And so what I'm looking at is, the sorts of things like, do liberals and conservatives respond the same way to the same stimuli? Do stimuli that are clearly from the political left affect conservatives differently than they do people on the political right and that sort of thing.
What kind of stimuli are we talking about here, just so we can paint a clear picture of kind of what is actually being done in the lab?
Yeah, so it's political and non-political stimuli. So the non-political stimuli we look at are things that tend to, evoke pretty strong emotional reactions that can be detected physiologically. So disgust images, threat images, violent images, and sort of like their natural counterparts, things that are happy, baby kittens, that sort of stuff. And then we also look at things like, very obviously political stimuli like presidential debates or political ads.
Right. So has this been a pretty crazy couple of weeks for you then? I'm curious to know how your lab work and experiments sort of shift when you have such a hot political scene at the moment with everything that's going on. Has it been a crazy time?
Yeah, not so much in the lab. I mean, it's been a crazy time in the sense of because of some of the work we do in the lab. Once every 4 years, you tend to get popular with journalists. But, the sort of stuff that we do in the lab, it's hard to respond in real time to the sorts of things that are going on. So the sort of work that we do in the lab is based, there are sort of like long time planning horizons involved in it. You have to get through ethics boards and that sort of thing. So, we can't just, that the race has been called Trump is the president. We can't just drag in a bunch of people off the street and start slapping censures on them and seeing how they react to various stimuli.
Right. Have you started any new experiments, or do you have any experiments that are in preparation since the election? Any observations that have come up that have made you think, okay, that would be maybe an interesting phenomenon to study in the lab?
Well, one of the things that we've been doing long term over this year, and we did it deliberately to sort of like do it over the time span of a long presidential campaign and its aftermath, is we were looking at how people respond to conflictual political stimuli. And basically what we were using as the stimuli was a very contentious debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Right.
And what we're trying to look at is, if you respond to that physiologically, do you perceive yourself as being, more stressed out because of politics? Do you think politics is making you more anxious? Are you losing sleep because of politics? Are you harming your social relationships because of politics? And what we're trying to figure out is, if you're physiologically responding to these, very conflictual political stimuli, effectively, is there some sort of like subconscious response that is really underlying the stress that people are feeling from politics? And, what downstream consequences experiencing that sort of stress and anxiety from politics has, not just on your mental health, but on your social health.
Yeah. I read a statistic that absolutely blew my mind from some of your work, that approximately 40% of the people in the United States, I'm not sure if this has been replicated outside of the United States, it's something I wanted to ask you, feels or suffers some sort of stress from politics. And even more severely, 4% suffer suicidal thoughts as a direct result of politics. Can you explain those results? Because that kind of blew my mind when I heard that.
Yeah, it kind of blew my mind the first time we did that. We got those sort of results, but they have been replicated. We did that study first in 2017, and we replicated it twice in 2020, and we've replicated it once in 2024, and we've found pretty consistent results. If anything, there's been a slight uptick, but not a lot. The primary story is that politics seems to be sort of like this chronic stressor for people. And it's that last statistic that you mentioned that really blew my mind. I mean,
Right.
Consistently what we found across, 4 separate studies, 4 different samples. There's even 2 different polling companies that we've used. And consistently what we're finding is 1 in 5 American adults say they've had suicidal thoughts because of politics. Or not 1 in 5, but 1 in 20 adults has had suicidal thoughts because of politics. And that really shocked me. That when we first got that result, I thought this has to be some sort of sampling error.
Right.
But now we've replicated it kind of like independently 3 times. The data says what the data says. And the data says 1 in 20 Americans, agree with the statement, I've had suicidal thoughts because of politics.
That's absolutely bonkers. I mean, I'm incredibly so far removed from that as an idea that it's hard to even imagine. Like I might not be a fully civic person in this idea, but like I don't think I've had a single molecule of cortisol created in my nervous system due to politics. It just doesn't. I don't really pay attention to it too much. I am, I try to be a good person, but I just don't follow the news. I think a lot of it is just stress inducing. Do you think this would replicate outside of the US? Because I think in the US, the politics is such a different thing than it is in the rest of the world. It's bombarded at you in all these different ways. It's dramatized. It's a competition. It's a fight. It's so dramatic that. Do you think it's a recipe of sort of social media and the channels that people interact with that politics from?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Evan. I don't have any data to back this up, so I'm speculating here, but I would think that we would see similar sorts of things in much of the industrialized West. Now, would it be to the same extent as it is in the United States? I guess my hypothesis would you would see it, but not as at higher levels as you see in the United States. And where I'm coming with from that is, like, the UK is probably the system outside of the United States that I'm most familiar with. I mean, you look at the divisions that have been driven around Brexit, which still haven't fully healed, the incredibly contentious general election that they just went through, these social cleavages over, Palestine, or in the UK, an immigration would be a good one. These are things that, literally drive people out onto the streets. And people are yelling and chanting and waving flags, but sometimes they're actually driven to violence.
Right.
So I would tend to think that, and I mean, if you look at Germany, for example, I mean, that governing coalition just fell apart. You're seeing the rise of the AfD, Marine Le Pen's group in France. I mean, you're seeing all these sorts of social cleavages where it's sort of like essentially a polarization of politics.
Absolutely.
And polarization essentially equals stress and anxiety. So that's kind of why I would expect to see it in other places.
And you made another interesting point there, that the stress has been increasing, but not a crazy amount. If you were only a, bystander of the news and sort of the world events of the last 5 years, you might expect that stress to have doubled or to increased quite a lot, but you're only seeing sort of an incremental increase. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much correct for what we're seeing from the survey research that we've done. When we initially started looking at this, we were wondering whether some of this was a Trump effect.
Right.
Because, we did our first survey in March 2017, and Donald Trump had been inaugurated, just a couple of months before that. And then when we sort of did later surveys in 2020, we thought, at the tail end of the Trump administration, we thought we'd see a drop-off, and we didn't. If anything, we saw a small incremental increase. And then when we were doing surveys like this summer, it was sort of like the same sort of story. I mean, I guess one of the things is that we can't rule out a Trump effect, right? Because he has essentially been, a very salient and visible figure in politics.
Yeah,
certainly
for at least a decade, for at least a decade now. Just the world has definitely gotten weirder since I've been seeing his name more and more.
Right. But I mean, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was social media. I mean, I think one of the things that I don't think we can sort of blame all of this on Donald Trump. I mean, the environment in which we live, certainly the information environment in which we live, is simply different now.
Yeah.
And I think, not enough people really realize that, social media is a pretty new thing. I mean, it's really only been around in terms of its penetration of society for 10 or 15 years. And, and one of the knock-on consequences that I don't think was fully thought through by, people adopting social media was the fact that it makes it virtually impossible to escape politics now.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of us wander around with these little supercomputers in our pockets that are like, if you lived in the United States and you were paying attention to politics and you were even modestly active on social media, somehow somebody got a hold of your information and you were getting, send money to this person, or, that candidate is going to, leave the Republican flames if they get elected. And I mean, it's constant. It's 24/7.
Yeah.
And if you look at sort of like the media environment, I mean, it's so fragmented now that, there's, essentially, people are trying to monetize outrage. And, the unfortunate consequence of that in politics is it's a universally stressful and anxiety-inducing stimulus that's just hard to escape.
Right. Something I was thinking about is that our stress systems obviously date back millions of years. And something that's also dated back a very, very long amount of time is basically political systems, how humans and how mammals and apes and chimps have organized themselves in groups. So I'm curious, do you think that this political stress could be a specific stress mechanism that we all have ingrained in ourselves to be kind of cautious about how we're organizing ourselves in societies and groups?
Yeah,
Because
that's a pretty insightful question. And sorry to cut you off there, but
no, no,
I was
go,
kind of getting excited about my answer
please,
because I kind of geek out on this stuff.
please go.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, there are a couple of, an anthropologist and a primatologist, Franz van der Waal and Robert Sapolsky. And, Franz van der Waal is especially well known for like essentially studying the politics of chimps and apes. And they do, there are power hierarchies and, in those bands. And, you read some of those books and it's sort of like, oh my God, this sounds like I'm reading about a state legislature or something. And then, Robert Sapolsky's, primarily what he's known for is the impact on the impact of stress. If you're an alpha male that gets, dethroned, I mean, that has a hormonal effect on you. And that, lower ranking, people who rank lower in these power hierarchies and these, I'm trying to remember the actual primate that he studies. It's not chimps, but it's something like that. But, the let's say the chimps who are lower in these power hierarchies do suffer from, physiologically measurable levels of stress and anxiety.
Right.
And, part of our evolutionary heritage, I think, is, that sort of reaction. I think is hardwired into us. This is not something, I think you're 100% correct. This is not something that is a product of the modern political era, or a stressful reaction to effectively politics is something that we can observe in chimps and has probably always been a part of our evolutionary heritage.
Right.
The problem is politics is just a little different today. I mean, the context is different. I mean, if you go back to, tribal bands or the Roman Empire or whatever, you weren't dealing with social media and cable TV news and all of that sort of stuff. It's just harder to escape from these days.
Right. So it's easy to conceive that we have some maybe specific stress mechanism that basically tracks our position in our hierarchy, tracks how the society is forming, tracks how we're progressing in that society, our role in that society and everything. And then you just have this megaphone rocket blaster of social media, which is just accelerating that small mechanism.
Yeah, more or less. I think that's an accurate summary of what's going on. I think one of the things that's different about politics now is we have become so tribal in our politics, and it has increasingly become part of our core identity.
Yeah.
So if you're a liberal and I'm conservative, and I say something about, Kamala Harris or AOC that is, not very pleasant, you view it as denigrating those people. You take it personally. You take it as if I just insulted your grandma.
Yeah.
And, I think that is really taking that stimulus is really reflecting our underlying evolutionary heritage. It's sort of like, the tribe is being threatened here, not just my position in it. And, that sort of like has a very sort of like implicit, subconscious reaction. It's something that basically, kicks off your fight or flight system and prepares you to take action.
Right. Is there any difference in right or left or conservative in liberal in how they feel stress in this 40% of adults that self-declare themselves as feeling stressed due to politics? Is there any tilt politically?
Yeah, we believe there is. One of the things that we've consistently found is that people on the political left tend to report these sorts of effects more than those on the political right.
Right.
We're not 100% sure why that is, because, one of the things that we expected to see was, when Donald Trump lost and the Democrats had, a pretty good year in 2020 and a pretty good year in 2022, we were expecting to see, what we were really curious about is sort of like, if conservatives aren't doing well, will their anxiety and stress levels go up? And they've, at least in our data, they've tended to stay, pretty noticeably below the levels of those on the political left. And there's quite a bit of research out there that suggests that conservatives, for example, tend to be happier than liberals. Conservatives tend to suffer from fewer mental health problems than liberals. And there's huge controversies over why that might be, or even whether these differences exist. But our data is certainly consistent with those sorts of.
I am sorry, we got disconnected there. So your last point was interesting to me because you say that the left are more sensitive to negative emotion and seem to experience stress more than the right or conservatives might, which might align with people's general view if they are kind of a standard by looking at the news, social media, all the rest. They might think that the left is more sensitive, and that makes sense. But after diving into more of the neuroscientific literature, in preparation for my conversation with you and in preparation for a video I'm making, one of the consistent findings is that conservatives have larger amygdala, correct? Mm-hmm. And the amygdala is the fear-detecting, fear-threat sensor in the brain. It's going to see a stimuli and it labels it on a spectrum of, scary to benign. So it's kind of interesting that conservatives that have that sort of overly sensitive threat detector still experience less negative emotion and experience less stress than liberals. Is that correct, or kind of talk around that?
Yeah, so I think the two big differences that have been found neurologically between liberals and conservatives are that conservatives tend to have larger and perhaps more active amygdalas, and liberals tend to have larger and perhaps more active anterior cingulate cortexes. Higher amygdalar activation doesn't necessarily translate into, higher levels of fear. What it might be doing is just making you more sensitive to threat.
Right.
So one of the things that we've done is we've looked at what sort of stimuli tend to get the attention of liberals versus conservatives. And there's been, some controversy over this, and, some people have said they've replicated and some people said they haven't found anything. So take this with a pinch of salt. But at least what we found is that when you put threatening stimuli in you present people with a collage of images, and some of these are threatening and some of them are not. Conservatives tend to go straight to those threatening images, and they just tend to spend more time compared to liberals looking at those images. And that doesn't necessarily, and some people, when some of this showed up in the media, that how it was interpreted is we'd found out that conservatives were more scared than liberals or were more afraid of liberals. And that was not what we found at all, and that's not what we claimed. Okay. It was that conservatives were more attentive to things that were potentially threatening.
Right.
And, and maybe that's one of the things, and I mean, this is absolutely speculative, because we're still trying to sort out, what the underlying biological differences are and how they really translate into, complex attitudes and behaviors like those surrounding politics. But, one potential explanation is what these amygdala differences do is they just make some people more sensitive to potential threats in their environment, which is, that's not a bad thing. That's not a derogatory, sometimes we're accused of taking cracks at conservatives, and that's genuinely not what we're trying to do.
What are the physiological responses that you're measuring in a test like this?
So we're measuring the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight system. So how we do that is we essentially measure, it's the activation of your sweat glands is what it boils down to. We run a small electric current through the tips of people's fingers and measure electrical resistance. And what happens is when your sweat glands open and close on your fingers, they act like electrical resistors. And what controls those sweat glands is your sympathetic nervous system. And so, we've got a pretty good clean measure of your sympathetic nervous system there. But we can also measure things like respiration, heart rate. We also do electromyography, which is basically muscle contractions. So we put sensors on people's faces on the major muscles associated with emotion. Because sometimes even if you can't really see somebody frowning or smiling, you can still detect electrical activity in those muscles, which could be reflective of an underlying emotional reaction to something. And in some cases, not always, but in some cases, that can be predictive of political orientations.
Interesting. So then, on these different physiological recordings, how did conservatives compare to liberals in response to these threatening stimuli, images, noises, all the rest?
Yeah, well, what we found, and this is kind of controversial now because there was a big study. Actually, I was tangentially involved in it. We brought in one of the people who did it to our lab, and I really encouraged them to do the replication, and they failed to replicate it. But what we've found in our lab is that conservatives tend to be more reactive to images that reflect threat and disgust. And the evidence that we found in our lab is a little less strong on liberals, but generally speaking, what we found is that liberals tend to respond marginally more to positively valenced images, puppy dogs and rainbows sorts of things.
Do we have any idea of the order of causality here? Because I know the genetics is very interesting, but do you think people are born conservatives and hence grow larger amygdalas, or have larger amygdalas and then become conservatives, and then the same for anterior cingulate cortexes and liberals?
Well, this is what I think happens is I think we are, our genetics determine, our genetics they do not predetermine what we're going to be. What our genetics and the environment that we find ourselves in combine to do is they tend to sort of like affect our cognition, what we pay attention to, what we remember. They, genetics and the environment also combine to sort of like shape how we respond to uncertainty, for example. And what all of those things do is I think they predispose us to be more receptive to some sorts of political appeals over other sorts of political appeals. So, our term for it is basically what your biology does. And there's not a clear dividing line between biology and psychology. It's really your psychobiology. What your psychobiology does is it predisposes you. In other words, it pushes the probabilities one way or another. But one of the things that I'm really careful to point out is we are not, I repeat, we are not genetic or biological determinists. People still have agency. You can be completely predisposed to be a conservative and still rationally think your way into be a liberal, and vice versa. But I think a lot of people, one of the things that got us started down this road and doing this sort of study is, if you ask people about their political attitudes and why they believe what they believe politically, they tend to think that their attitudes are common sense and that they're rational. And you don't have to push people that hard to find that in most people, they don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, simply in the sense of, I mean, they know how they feel, but their attitudes are being driven by those feelings more than they are by reliable, verifiable information and its analysis. And politics, we came around to the point of view that politics, or a lot of political attitudes and behaviors, are essentially driven by emotion. And people can't fully explain why they are doing what they are doing politically. They rationalize it a lot, but we believe that it's primarily being driven by emotion. And so, what sort of like sent us down this whole rabbit hole is, where do those emotions come from? How do they arise? And why are some people responding to, you can take two different people, put them in exactly the same place at exactly the same time and give them exactly the same political stimulus, and they'll respond differently to it emotionally. Why is that? And does that help explain why liberals and conservatives are different? And we believe it does.
Very interesting. Can you try to define emotion? Because I've looked a lot into the neuroscience of emotion is fascinating to me, and I really like Lisa Feldman Barrett's work on the neuroscience of emotion. But whenever someone mentions that word, I'm like, I need you to operationalize it in some way, because it can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. When we first started doing this research, I pushed some psychologists who study emotion on a definition. And, you can ask 20 different psychologists who are studying emotion, and you might get at least 10 different definitions of emotion. The definition that I've always been attracted to is emotion is an action predisposition.
An action predisposition.
It's a psychological state that prepares you to take an action or to, process something in a certain way. And honestly, one of the reasons I like that definition is that it's clear and it's succinct, and it doesn't go on for a paragraph where at the end of it you're thinking, what does that really mean?
Yeah. No, I like it. I can agree with that.
Because it's funny, right? Everybody intuitively understands what being mad is, or angry, or happy, or sad, or being in love. But you try to come up with a definition for what all of those feelings constitute. And it's a lot harder than you think.
Absolutely. In all of the neuroscience podcasts I've done, all the books that I've read, one of the most fascinating rabbit holes that I've dove down, which I would recommend everyone do, is trying to look into the neuroscience of emotion. I think there's a lot of practical takeaways in terms of how to live your life and how to guide your actions, as in emotions are predictions being one of the most important ones. They're not always accurate summations of what your body is feeling in a particular moment. There's just a lot of practical takeaways there. I think Lisa Feldman Barrett's work is incredible. But it's interesting to hear emotions be brought into politics. Because as you say, people think they're very logical and consistent with their politics, but emotions change so much. You could be conservative one day and liberal another, and it just depends how many hours of sleep you had. Is that sort of consistent with what you've seen?
Yeah, I think people are a little more consistent in their ideological orientation, but I think their ideological orientations are at least as much emotionally driven than they are rationally driven. And especially in the polarized era that we're in, people just get significantly psychologically attached to one side or the other. And, a good example of this is the day after the election, I was teaching. And, I'm at the University of Nebraska, which is, it's a red state, and our student body is, roughly 40% liberal, 40% conservative, and, 20% in the middle. And when I walked into class on Wednesday morning, half my class looked really happy and half looked like somebody had shot their dog.
Right.
And I think you could predict their partisan and ideological leanings simply by looking at their faces and the emotions that they were conveying.
Yeah. I would have paid to be in America for the few days after the whole election kind of unraveled, just because it's hard to even comprehend exactly what's happening, being a bystander from Irish person living in Spain, looking at politics tangentially. It's just, the whole thing just seems so crazy. And things like tribalism and polarization, I definitely want to dive into later. But one of the truly insane statistics, again, comes out of these hereditary studies where they do twin studies on genetics. And one of their findings consistently is that about 50% of the variance in your political ideology is down to genetics, which I think, again, is sort of a profoundly strange idea as someone who always thought they were sculpted by their experiences. Right, I went through my life in the age of 5, I overcame that challenge, and that's why I now look at that challenge again in this way. And I worked hard here, and now I believe I can work hard. And like, people believe they're products of experiences, right? Which is why it's very hard to square this idea that 50% of the variance comes down to genetic.
Yeah. And it's not just twin studies anymore. I was involved in some of those twin studies. Actually, it was our lab that did the first comprehensive political survey of a twins registry. And you're absolutely right. There's been a ton of those studies done by now, and they all sort of like triangulate on politics not only being, or ideological orientation, not only being heritable, but being highly heritable, like more heritable than a propensity to alcoholism, more heritable than sexual orientation. The sorts of traits that people readily accept are genetically influenced. Politics is way higher than that. And the lowest estimates are around 40%. That ranges from 40% on up. But it's not just quantitative genetics. It's not just twin studies. There are a number of adoption studies out now. So basically what they do is they look at individuals who were adopted at a very young age and examine, are these individuals politically more like their biological parents, which they may have had no contact with, since they were literally 2 months old, or are they more like their adoptive parents? So that's a good naturally occurring experiment, to sort of like, is it the environment or is it your biology? And those generally conclude that those individuals tend to look more like their biological parents in their political attitudes and behaviors. And there's even been some GWAS studies, which are genome-wide association scans. And, basically what these look at is just variation in your genome. And they've looked at how variations in the genome correlate with political orientation and found significant correlations. There's even some studies out there, which frankly I don't trust, that are sort of like single gene predictors. And I just don't trust those because, the notion that you've got a gene that's significantly exerting influence on a political attitude, I just find that that's a step too far for me. But if you've
Right.
got all sorts of these, different genetic variants, sort of like pushing you in one direction or another because, they help direct your attention one way or the other. They help you remember certain things more than another. They help you or push you towards emotionally react to one message or another. Then, yeah, it totally makes sense to me. The big issue, Evan, is not whether politics is heritable or not, because it is. I mean, the evidence is just so overwhelming right now that anyone who disagrees with that proposition, the onus is on them to say why this mountain of evidence saying otherwise is somehow wrong. The real question, and, the reason why I run a psychophysiology lab rather than a genetics lab, is how does that translate?
Right.
I mean, because nobody thinks you've got we're going to find the conservative gene or the liberal gene. The big question is like, if it's that highly heritable and it's genetically influenced, through what mechanisms or your biology, literally your DNA, pushing you towards becoming a liberal or a conservative? And the only honest answer to that, even after putting in a good 20 years of research by this point, is we're not really sure. I mean, we've got some ideas, but we're not really sure.
I think all the best researchers and neuroscientists that I've had on always say we're not really sure. It's a very humble, modest way of looking at it. But what would be your instincts? What would be your best guesses after, putting in 2 decades into this field in terms of how DNA is driving these, as you said? You brought up a few good ones there in terms of it's controlling our cognition, in our memory, our attention. Do you think those are the biggest ones in our DNA fundamentally pushing us towards different thinking styles and cognitive styles?
Yeah, I do. So, like, here would be my best guess based on what I know so far is, you haven't got a gene. Genes don't produce a conservative attitude or a liberal attitude directly. What genes uncontroversially do is they build your biological information processing systems. They build your sympathetic nervous system. They build your parasympathetic nervous system. They build your central nervous system, which includes your brain. And these are the systems by which we interact with the world and make sense of it. These are the things that, affect how emotionally reactive we are to stimuli. These are things that, affect, literally what feels good in our gut or what doesn't. And I think it's reasonable to argue that there are systematic differences in those systems. You don't have the same systems that I do. We have the same basic systems, but there's a ton of variation within those systems between you and I. And some of those differences systematically map onto politics. There's a former PhD student of ours, Pete Patemi. He did some research looking at olfaction, like how people smell, and found that differences in olfaction can predict political attitudes and behaviors. Yeah, well, we did.
Why on earth is that?
We did a study on that. We were looking at androstenone, which is a hormone that is known to be associated with social hierarchy and pack animals. And it's actually something that you can, some people can smell it.
Interesting.
And some people experience it as a bad odor. Some people experience it as a pleasant odor, and some people can't smell it at all. And, the takeaway finding from our study, and it was just one small study, I wouldn't vest 100% confidence in this, but this is what the data said in our study, is that people who could detect androstenone were more sensitive to social hierarchies. So not quite conservatism, but sort of like conservatism. And the reason why,
so bizarre.
Why are political scientists looking at olfaction? Why, a couple of my grad students have said over the years, when I went to get my PhD in political science, I didn't realize I'd be carrying around, bottles of spit and having people smell stuff. But olfaction, your olfactory sensors go straight into your brain.
Right.
And they go straight into the emotional part of your brain. This, you can smell certain things and they tend to evoke real clear memories, for example.
Yeah.
They're really wired pretty tightly to our emotions. And if part of this is, as we've talked about, tied to our emotions, it kind of made sense to us that, maybe olfaction is one of those sensory organs that, somewhere back in our lineage somewhere could help explain why we ended up with these predispositions in the modern world to go left or right. And, one of the things that Pete did was he looked at genetic variation in olfaction, which is actually pretty well worked out. And we did our study, and there are a couple of other studies out there that have actually looked at, can you smell this? What does it smell like to you? Does it smell good or bad? And we can actually predict, with reasonable accuracy, political orientations from that. And again, we're a long way from 100%. I don't want to sort of like say, hey, sniff this T-shirt and I can tell you whether you're a liberal or a conservative.
Right.
But what I can do is I can guess better than chance with that information. And so something systematic is going on.
That's amazing. That is so interesting. I wish this sort of nuance was able to penetrate the mainstream, because I just think it's so fascinating. People think that they come up with these ideologies themselves, but if your damn smell is so linked to your ideology, it's just proof that this is biologically ingrained.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I've had people argue with me saying, like, this cannot be genetic because my parents are conservative and I'm a liberal, and I'm like, well, genetics doesn't work like that. Brown-eyed parents can
probabilistic.
have a blue-eyed kid. It's you know,
Yeah.
things get scrambled up when you reproduce.
So what are the other chemicals that predict political orientation? So the one that is somehow a subconscious or even conscious signal of social hierarchy kind of makes sense. What are the other chemicals? Are they also somehow related to, signaling something about your environment in some particular way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the only sort of like olfaction studies, or like the hormone, pheromone stuff that you can smell, are the ones that are linked to things like androstenone that are established as, at least amongst pack animals, is they're a sign of, you can figure out where you are in the social hierarchy, that sort of thing. The other stuff that, is sort of like chemical or hormonal is more internal, and it's less predictive of ideology than in political engagement, period. So the big ones that we've done is we've looked at cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and we found actually, we did this one small study, and I keep hoping somebody will replicate it because I'm not sure I believe it. But seriously, I mean, that's what our data says. But I mean, you can get a false positive from a small sample.
Of course.
But it was about 120, 125 people, and we found a correlation of zero point 0.3 between their baseline cortisol level and their levels of political participation. And that's a correlational study, but it's also an observational study. There was no self-report there. We had their voting records, and we measured their baseline cortisol. And a 0.3 correlation, correlation goes from 0 to 1, so 0.3 doesn't sound that much. But the single biggest environmental or social predictor of voting or political engagement that political scientists have managed to find is education.
Interesting.
And education, it depends on the sample, but education correlates with political engagement at a rate of about 0.2 or 0.25. And we
so
found
small as well.
cortisol had a higher correlation with voter participation, with political engagement, than education.
So interesting.
And this is one of the reasons why I was saying, like, I'm not sure I believe this.
Yeah.
Because that is a biological marker, and we can better predict, whether you are politically engaged with that biological marker, or at least we could amongst 120, 125 adults that we assayed, than we could if we knew your education levels, which which to a political scientist is just sort of like mind-blowing.
Right. When were those cortisol assays taken in relation to, was that taken in a particular time correspondence to an election or a particular event of political engagement?
We've done a couple of cortisol studies. The one that we were just talking about wasn't related to any particular election or anything like that. Basically, what we did is we took their cortisol and then we got their voting records from the Secretary of State. So it's just a correlational study like that. Okay. One of the things that we did based on the results of that, we actually got a group of Nebraska voters to let us decide how they should vote in an election. Because you can vote by mail here, or you can go to the polls in person. And so we had a group of people who, they all had to do it at 7 p.m. They could vote by mail. They could go vote in person. And our control group was, we had a group of people go to a local convenience store and buy like a Mars bar. So it's a social interaction, but it's not a political interaction. And what we found is those who went to the polls, who actually directly engaged in politics, their cortisol got elevated more than those voting in mail, and critically more than those going and having a social interaction. It's simply the fact of sort of like, even putting a small toe in the political arena does seem to raise people's stress.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And there's all sorts of interesting things that come out of that. And I keep hoping. I mean, I tend to get so excited about stuff that I end up taking on more than I can chew. And we really haven't followed up those cortisol studies. But I really wish some people would, because I'm actually really fascinated by this. One of the things that we noticed, we had 9 people out of the 120, 125 in that first study that I was talking about who had served an elective office in some form or another. And I mean, these were pretty low-level offices, but they'd actually been elected to an office. Those 9 people were, don't quote me on this, but it's sort of like they were 9 of the 15 lowest baseline cortisol level readings that we took.
Interesting.
And that seems to indicate that the people who get engaged in politics are okay with the stimulation.
It's probably maybe a habituation effect or something, being exposed to it for long enough.
Right. And that could be part of it. But that's part of my point. We don't know. There are some people who, their HPA axis, basically their fight or flight systems, they just take a lot more poking to go off. Are those the people who are more likely to get engaged in politics? And is it the fact that people who have, more sensitive HPA axis, the sort of thing that will shoot you full of cortisol if you're exposed to conflict, are those the people who are more likely to avoid participating in politics? I'd really like to know the answer to that.
Yeah, a lot of questions and a lot of research that needs to be done. Well, what do you think are some of the other kind of big headline findings that Neuropolitics has came out with in relation to biological or brain differences between conservatives and liberals that you think people listening should know about, but they probably don't?
Well, one of the key things, and it seems to have been replicated. I know there was one study that came out just this year that did seem to replicate some earlier studies that suggest there is a difference in the amygdala and there is a difference in the ACC. So there seem to be structural differences. There have also been some studies looking at, brain activation and using those patterns of brain activation to predict ideological leaning, and have been reasonably successful at doing that. So this is not survey data, are you a liberal or a conservative? This is just sort of like looking at patterns of brain activity through a functional MRI and seeing whether variation in those patterns systematically map onto political orientation and belief. And there's at least some evidence that those correlations are real. We did one study, the one brain study that I was involved in, and I'm not a neuroscientist. I didn't do any of the, the sticking people in the fMRI or anything, but we contacted a very well-known neuroscientist, Reed Montague, and basically we knocked on his door, sent a loopy political scientist, say, hey, if we can get some money, can you stick a bunch of people in one of your tubes and look at their brains for us? And he and some of his PhD students did it. And what we gave them is a protocol that we've been using in our physiology lab. And so what they were looking at were still images, and they were not political images. So what they were looking at were, pictures of poo in a toilet, or pictures of 2 people wailing on each other. And they ran the analysis. We didn't do the analysis. So we couldn't have put a thumb on the outcome if we wanted to. They ran the analysis, and according to their analysis, they could correctly classify the self-identification, ideological self-identification of the 90 participants in that study with an accuracy of 90%.
Wow. It's very high.
Yeah, and again, it's a small study, and that should not be considered by definitive. What you need is another 10 studies saying more or less the same thing to really vest any confidence in it. But that was another one of those, ever since I got into this line of research, we'll do some studies and then we'll get the results and I'll be like, yeah, I'm not sure I believe that.
Yeah.
And I mean, and as long as you're honest and upfront, you make your data available, and some of our stuff is replicated and some of it hasn't. But what is clear from the ton of research that's going on is anyone argues that there's no biological signature associated with politics. Boy, they're arguing against an awful lot of evidence
Right.
these days.
It seems that way. In the neural patterns that they were able to decipher as correlated with conservatives or liberals, were they able to decipher anything in those neural readings? Was it a emotional reaction of disgust, of love, of passion, of empathy? Were they able to look into those neural patterns and see what they specifically related to in any way?
Yeah,
Were they memories,
I'm not aware of any studies that have done that. Although, there's more and more studies coming out. I'm not saying that no such studies exist, but yeah, you got me flat-footed on that one. I really don't know.
Yeah, I'm just curious. How did you decide on the photos that you were going to show them, like the poo in the toilet? What's the methodology behind that?
So there's a couple of ways that you can do it. There's actually a sort of like pre-validated database
Okay.
that psychophysiologists have used for years, called the International Affective Picture System. I think that's right.
Okay.
The acronym is IAPS. And so these images have been, with a large sample, have been rated on the basis of valence, whether they're, happy or sad, good or bad. And they've been rated on how arousing they are. And some of them actually have been rated on physiological response. And so what you can do is you can look at, you can, if you're a researcher, you can gain access to this database and you can select images that, this is a disgust picture and it tend to have a big physiological response, and people rated it as highly disgusting. And we've also sort of like in a miniature way created our own databases that way. Basically, we've, because that old system, let's just say that they're not the most sharpest, clearest pictures. I think some of them date from the 90s. And we did this one study. One of my PhD students was really interested in this. We were looking at how people responded to erotica. And she was very interested in sort of like, especially differences in males and females, and whether that predict attitudes on things like, sex before marriage or gay marriage, abortion, those sorts of things. And like the erotica image from IAPS, like this,
80s stick drawings.
Yeah, it's sort of like Playboy and Penthouse from the 80s. And I mean, and I don't want to cast any aspersions on my undergraduates, but you bring the average 20-year-old into a lab and show them that, and then you
What
basically
the hell
get,
is this?
yeah, well, you get no response, right? It's not shocking or anything. You can see it on Netflix on any given Tuesday.
I gotcha. Makes sense. I understand what you're saying now. That's very funny. What do you think all of your knowledge on these biological predispositions in politics, kind of what does it say about tribalism, the tribalism and polarization that we see today?
I think one of the things that it does is it helps explain why we are polarized. It's because, we effectively go through the political arena just feeling in our gut that, this makes more sense to me. immigrants are great, taco truck on every corner. That sounds awesome. Or sort of like, oh my God, immigrants, drug cartels and criminals. I don't think those sorts of reactions are particularly well thought through. I don't think those are, those lead to rational policy responses. They lead to rationalized policy responses. But it's
Right.
those sorts of gut reactions that I think, can push us into, well, Donald Trump is like, build a wall. Yeah, I'm going with this guy. He knows what he's talking about. Um, you know, um, Joe Biden is much more open and friendly and wants to get a path to citizenship for these good, hardworking, regular folk. And I mean, you add up like a million different things like that, different issues, different stimuli, and basically you can see how, especially when elites are sort of like, you're competing for power by trying to expand their coalition into by appealing to sort of like a base coalition, a core group. That's a pretty good way to do it, because it plays on the evolutionary machinery, not just of our brains, but sort of like the unconscious processes that lead us to have attitudes and behaviors. So that's one thing. I think it can explain how we can get so polarized and why we can be so tribal. And a more hopeful thing is, I think it can also offer at least, some small glimmer of hope into how we can deal with those differences. And this is something that we've looked into a little bit, and we have published a study on this. And that, if you can convince someone, that person who's different from you is not stupid, they're not stubborn. They literally, not metaphorically, they literally see and experience the world differently from you.
Right.
What we found is that tends to lower the political temperature a little bit. And, maybe, and I mean, we work in a lab and we do surveys, we crunch numbers and stuff. This isn't, the Christmas table or anything like that, where you're dealing with your crazy Aunt Jane and your crazy Uncle Joe. But, maybe if more people knew about this and accepted the fact that, you're different from me, not because you hate me or you're stupid or you want to drive the country off a cliff, but you literally see the world different from me. I
Right.
mean, I think that does open up a space to have more constructive engagement. And one of the things that, it's taught me, and I do this in my classroom now, because I see it all the time with my students. It's sort of like, trying to persuade each other. If you're a conservative and you think you're going to get that liberal to, the scales are going to fall from their eyes and they're going to be like, oh yeah, now I'm a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. It's like, you're dreaming.
Right.
That's just not going to happen. I mean, I mean, it can happen, but it's a pretty rare occurrence. And so it's actually, it even influences me in my teaching is, don't stay away from each other. Go talk to each other and don't expect to change each other's minds. If you
Yeah.
walk out of that just having some sympathy and empathy and respect for the other person, that's enough. That's fine. We can deal with that.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. It's one of the reasons that I felt the need to talk to more people like you doing research like this and to make a video about it, is because I see all of these debates in US politics and they've just turned into, gotcha moments, highlight clips for social media, and there's absolutely no genuine discussion. It's all vitriol and propaganda and just rhetoric, and it's just, there's no well-meaning discussion around it. And I feel like if people genuinely sat down and tried to understand a little bit about these biological predispositions, that just because the person across the table of you identifies as a conservative and you identify as a liberal, if you're both moderately, politically leaning people, which most people are, you should be able to agree on a whole lot of things. And understanding that we are tribal and we do become polarized and we are we suffer massive confirmation bias. I looked a lot into, confirmation bias and having overconfidence in the ideas that your tribe espouses and being blind to the ones that the opposite tribe espouses just because it has a different label. Understanding all of these things and bringing them to light should help people have more conversations.
Yeah, and even, on a sort of like more general level, that it's advantageous to society to have both sorts
Absolutely.
of groups in it. I mean, you know, like effective, all societies, or at least all mass societies that I'm aware of, have groups of people in it who think we should stick to the traditional tried and true ways, and a group in it who thinks we should change and do things differently, which basically translates into the right and the left. And essentially, the left is to make sure that the baby isn't sitting in dirty bath water, and the right is there to make sure the baby doesn't get thrown out with that bath water. I mean,
Right.
you remove one perspective from society, and that's probably as unhealthy as having sort of like the radical polarization that we're certainly witnessing in the United States right now.
Yeah. I don't know if this is an over extrapolation, but do you think that's the reason why those two biological predispositions exist? Because they do optimally serve societies in different ways. One of them pushes them forward, and then the other stabilizes that and creates a functional society within that. And then liberals push forward again, and then we create some stability again. Like, you need both types of people. Like the saying in startups is that you need a liberal to start a company, but you need a conservative to run it. It kind of works the same for governments, for societies, for towns, and everything.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Evan. That's one that we've really thought about a lot. And we even sort of like write about this in one of our books. And we think it makes good evolutionary sense.
Yeah.
Especially if you believe in a group selection argument. If you imagine a hunter-gatherer tribe, having some people within that band saying, we should go over the hill and talk to the tribe over the hill. They got some good they got some good stuff, and having a group of people in that is like, well, you got to be careful of those people over the hill. God knows what they're doing over there. I mean, it's not. I guess the downside of having those groups is it could lead to paralysis or internal conflict. But in terms of sort of like some kind of an optimal balance of group preservation and safety and security and social order, but also making sure that that group advances and develops and gets better. I mean, I think it would be optimal to have both sorts of groups, and especially if you believe in group selection arguments, even if these are sort of like cultural group selection arguments rather than biological evolution, that makes a good deal of sense. I mean, the issue there, though, Evan, is you've got to be careful about just telling just so stories, right?
Right. Yeah.
And you could spin this through, and it's like, yeah, that makes perfect functional sense. That's what evolution is doing. But the problem is you can't make societies evolve in the lab, or at least we can't yet anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always cautious of evolutionary narratives that just make so much sense, because I know the brain also craves coherence, so we'll latch onto that story and be like, of course that's true. And it does seem so true, but that doesn't mean that there's no evidence for it. It's not evidence just because it seems so coherent and it seems so true.
Yeah. Yeah, I did have one of my PhD students once did an agent-based simulation.
Okay,
where,
cool.
Was trying to let a virtual silicon society evolve, and it programmed in these different sorts of traits to the agents, and did seem to be getting some results that sort of like were consistent with the, with the argument that I just laid out, but they never published it. So who knows?
Right. Very interesting. Is there any good science on how we can change our minds?
Yeah, I think I think there is. I think the key thing that psychologists seem to have sort of like landed on in order to, um, get someone else to change their mind or have you change your mind yourself is you have to have the motivation to want to do that. There's an inertia to what we believe that is really hard to overcome.
Right.
But I mean, I think there's more and more research coming out that people are willing to update their beliefs. It's just not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
And the thing that, the approach to doing that, or at least in the research that I've read, seems to be not sort of like hammering people with facts.
Yeah.
That's just not the way to do it.
Yeah.
The way to do it is to talk to people and get them to recognize inconsistencies or contradictions in their attitudes or beliefs. So the way to do it is like, not be judgmental, just be curious, just sort of like say, why do you believe that? How strongly do you believe that? Is there anything that would make you change your mind about that? This thing that you say, would you change your mind? Is there any evidence of that you're aware of? I don't know if you've ever heard of street level epistemology.
No.
Philosopher Peter Boghossian started it, but it's
I've heard of Peter Boghossian.
Yeah. And he started this whole thing, street level epistemology, but it's basically a 21st century of the Socratic method. They just grab people literally on the street and say, what do you believe? How strongly do you believe it? What would it take to change your mind? Is there any evidence of this? And I mean, these videos are on YouTube. You can watch them. And I find them fascinating because you can literally see, people consciously and cognitively grappling with a belief, sometimes for the first time. And
right.
And some people will actually sort of like change their beliefs. And then some, like, you take something really deep rooted, like a religious belief, for example, trying to let go of that, it's going to be hard.
Right.
I mean, because, as a matter of internal philosophy, that's an existential question for some people, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think ideology is like that for quite a few people. And so, if you're going to get people not necessarily to change their mind, but even making them open to sort of like constructive engagement with people who very strongly disagree with them on controversial and sensitive issues, is that sort of approach, non-judgmental, curious, and a willingness to engage and not sort of like react emotionally to whatever response you get. I think that's the key to opening up the possibility to change someone's mind, even if, the effort ultimately doesn't work.
Right. I wish there was a way that human beings could talk about ideas that didn't have labels like Democrat and conservative attached to them, right? Because if you could just talk about the substance of the idea, like I read a study that if you label a policy as being from the Democratic Party, it will increase agreement with Democrats.
Yeah.
And that's even when they had switched the party that had proposed it behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So literally just having that label and being like, oh, that's my tribe.
Yep.
Now all of my biases towards believing it. You could just strip away the labels, talk about substance and ideas, but that just seems too difficult because humans like labels. We like buckets. We like discrete information. It seems hard to rip that all away.
Yeah. I mean, I think I 100% agree with you, Evan. It would be great to strip all that away. I think if we could magically strip away those labels, though, we'd reinvent them pretty quickly.
Right. There's a need for them.
Yeah. Because I think this is deeply embedded in our nature. We're groupish. Politics is coalitional conflict in the pursuit of power. And that's a tailor-made process to create groups. So, if we call it, the Mars and Venus rather than liberals or conservatives or Democrats and Republicans, I think would probably have the conflicting groups. And I mean, this isn't modern. I mean, the founding fathers explicitly were anti-party. And parties were not envisioned. If you look at the Constitution, it doesn't say anything about political parties.
Right.
George Washington, several others sort of like spoke out very openly about, you've got to be careful. We don't want to split up into these partisan tribes. And those same guys split up into partisan tribes.
Right. Well, having a two-party system just seems kind of bonkers because it literally just boils it down to us or them. Like it's literally it's either us or them. At least having more parties might introduce more diversity of ideas and less just like, this is either my idea or it's not. It's not binary.
Yeah, there's trade-offs, right? And I'm glad you asked that question because I can actually speak as a political scientist rather than sort of like,
I've pulled you into the neuroscience arena for too much of this, I think.
Yeah. There's trade-offs, right? In a parliamentary system or sort of like a U.S. divided power system or any system where you've got, single-member districts first past the post, you tend to get two parties come out of that. And the advantage of that system, supposedly, is that the government can act.
Right.
And you can have accountability. It's sort of like, vote for us and we'll do X, Y, and Z, and they win, they get in. And if they don't do X and Y and Z, you know exactly why X, Y, and Z hasn't happened and who to punish next time. That's certainly the argument for parliamentary system. But the argument for something sort of like a multi-member district, multi-party system that you're describing about is you've got more space for different ideas to collect into a more sort of like coalitional government with different parties representing different interests rather than, this winner take all, you're with us or you're against us sort of thing.
Exactly. I'm by no means an expert in political systems whatsoever, but it just seems like having more than two would inherently be less tribal and less polarizing. Because at least you have two enemies and you don't just have one group of people to shoot a gun at. You kind of have like, there's more options, there's more variability, there's more exchange of ideas, more communication, less 1v1.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, I think popular opinion in the United States would be fairly supportive of the position that you're taking. When you poll Americans and say, do you want a realistic third party choice besides the Republicans and Democrats? Generally speaking, the overwhelming response is yes. The problem is when a third party presents themselves as like, look at us, we're a viable, legitimate alternative to the Democrats and the Republicans. Nobody votes for them.
Right. Yeah. Kevin, this has been such a pleasure. I've learned so much, and I think it's been an incredibly enjoyable conversation. It was one that's incredibly salient at the moment. If you want to leave people with one final note, perhaps the 40% of the people or more or less that perhaps are feeling stress at the moment with the current election results, what would you leave them with everything you know about biology, neuroscience, psychology, everything?
Yeah. So what I would leave them with is recognize that politics is a process. It has no end. So whatever is the existential election of the moment or the huge world-changing issue of the moment, 3 years from now, it won't be. It doesn't matter how much you spin this around in your head. Tomorrow the sun's going to come up, the world's going to turn, and things will go forward. I spent the 1990s telling my students, you need to take politics more seriously. And right now, in this moment, my message to people would be, don't take politics so seriously.
Right. The world goes on.
Yeah, exactly.
This has been incredible. Thank you so much, Dr. Kevin Smith. I wish you all the best with all your future research, and I hope your work and everything that you espouse gets more broadcasting, gets more distribution, and more people hear about your ideas.
Well, thank you, Evan, and thanks for the invitation. I've enjoyed chatting with you.
Such a pleasure.